Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone here today. My name is Jessie, a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, United States, and today I'll be sharing some of my research on religious coping during community-level crises in Indonesia. And this will be the outline of my presentation today. As we know, our world is no stranger to crisis. We have seen armed conflicts and violent extremist attacks, natural disasters, and extreme weather events, as well as public health emergencies such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Talking about crisis, research has found that how we manage and respond to a crisis, or in other words, how to cope with it, not only determines individual psychological outcomes, but also community resilience, which is a core component of crisis recovery. Studies have shown that each community has their own coping strategies. For example, studies among refugees at the Myanmar-Thailand border and survivors of the 2004 Asian tsunami preferred self-reflection, spirituality, and other unique individual and social coping strategies more than formal mental health services. So, due to the diversity of coping strategies, in order for us to help communities more effectively, there is a need to understand the coping strategies that a specific community tends to use. Indonesia is a country located in Southeast Asia with a population of more than 270 million people. It is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and it also has the largest Muslim population of all countries in the world. Religion plays an important role in the country, but it is common for people to identify themselves along religious lines. Most Indonesians view religion, God, and prayer as an important part of their lives. Indonesia has also faced various community-level crises, from natural disasters, violent extremist incidents, and the country was also a major COVID-19 epicenter last year. So keeping in mind the current literature on the diversity of coping strategies in different populations, we sought to understand how Indonesians deal with crises. To help answer this question, we took the COVID-19 pandemic as a case study. The COVID-19 pandemic was a prolonged major crisis which significantly impacted people's lives, including areas of health, work, finance, interpersonal relationships, and religious life. As such, in this study, we aim to understand the different ways people use religion to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, as well as the impacts of using religion to cope. We conducted in-depth interviews with 10 interviewees, which was also supported by a literature review of empirical studies focusing on religious coping in crises in Indonesia. Here is some information on the profile of the interviewees. 50% of them were males. As for religious affiliation, 40% were Muslims, 40% were Christians, and another 20% were Catholics. In terms of age, their ages ranged from 21 to 46 years old. All of them became a part of their current religion since they were born. And in terms of religious involvement, 50% were a member of a religious community, 30% held certain roles or often helped out in their community, while 20% were religious leaders. And all of them were living in Indonesia throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and were impacted by the pandemic in at least one area of life, either it was financial or work, interpersonal relations, or health. Using a semi-structured format, interviewees were asked about their participation and adherence to beliefs and practices of the organized religion, their experience in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as how they made sense of the pandemic from a religious perspective. So here I present the findings of the study. First, I will talk about the use of religion coping in general, and then I will discuss 4 aspects of religion that facilitated coping among interviewees. The study participants, first of all, revealed that seeking support from family and loved ones was their most used coping strategy during the pandemic. However, religion was still commonly used. For example, an excerpt from an interview with a 25-year-old female suggested that religion might be her second most commonly used type of coping. Meanwhile, another interviewee revealed that he doesn't usually tell other people about his problems. However, he has an internal conversation with a higher being, which in this case he calls God. Results of the interviews suggest that there are 4 aspects of religion that facilitated coping: the beliefs and teaching of the religion, activities or rituals, a community of people sharing the same belief system, and religious leaders who are authority figures and sources of support. So first, the current study found that religious beliefs influence the appraisal of events. When a crisis happens, people have the tendency to question why it happened, or in other words, they try to make sense of the crisis. A prominent theme identified from the interview was that the interviewees believed that a higher being has a plan behind the crisis. For example, this 32-year-old male interviewee believes that everything has been determined with an underlying reason or wisdom behind things. Interviewees also believe that crises are a test, aiming to increase their faith, devotion, and reliance on a higher being. With regard to the pandemic, some interviewers also mentioned that it was sort of a reminder of their limitations, such as that there are things that they cannot predict, or that they just needed rest, since they usually had worked long hours before the pandemic. The results of the study also suggest that religious beliefs were a source of consolation and hope during the crisis. So, for example, there's a belief that God does not give problems that is beyond people's abilities, and this was thought to be comforting. Another interviewee mentioned that even though he believed God is just and can punish, God's forgiveness is much bigger. And the view that religious beliefs are a source of hope is captured in this excerpt, in which the interviewee suggests that without faith, there is no hope. And when she knows that there is a higher being to help her, she feels strong. So moving on to religious activities. There are 4 types of religious activities that are used to cope with the pandemic. First, prayers, which can be addressed to a higher being, and it can contain whatever the person wishes to communicate. But it can also be topic specific for a special purpose. For example, prayers about outbreak or prayers to specially request for something. Second, reading religious teachings. This can not only take the form of reading religious books, but also watching sermons and reading religious content online. And then spiritual quiet time. For example, zikr, which has a literal meaning of remembering God, is a form of Islamic meditation. Christians also engage in quiet times called devotions, and praying and reading religious books are often included in the quiet time. Fourth, sharing sessions. Some religious communities organize small groups, either formally or informally, where members meet to share their experiences, life challenges, and these sessions are seen as a two-way activity. People have an outlet to share their difficulties, but also learn from other people's stories. And this can be seen as one of the benefits of being involved in a religious community. The interviewees revealed that religious communities have the role of facilitating the provision of social support. They can provide instrumental support, that is tangible help like money or masks and oxygen cylinders during the pandemic. An individual within the religious community also give encouragement to each other by sharing religious concepts or teachings that they believe to be relevant for a specific situation. The religious community also facilitated the sharing of information related to the pandemic through informal and formal networks. And this could be on public health measures and well as also changes to religious practices. Lastly, the religious community also facilitated companionship, that is the act of accompanying or being there during hospitalization, social isolation, or stay-at-home periods during the pandemic. All these kinds of support can be sought and given within one community or place of worship, but also even between communities, that's for example, one church and another church. In the current study, religious leaders were also identified as a source of authority and sources of support. So there was source of authority when it comes to like making sense of the pandemic or adapting religious rituals. So they had uh, discussions to resolve differences in opinion in relation to the changes to religious rituals during the pandemic. And so for some people, religious communities are their main support system, and religious leaders often become the first person to know or the first person people turn to when they face difficulties during the pandemic. So to recap the findings of the study, one learning point is that the nature of the crisis may influence the use of religion to cope with the pandemic. And actually, prior research has found that religious involvement is more likely when the crisis is perceived as not being able to be repaired. So, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic could be one of those cases. Religion also provides a framework for understanding and interpreting the crisis. And studies have found that when people redefine the crisis as benevolent, it can lead to more positive feelings and adaptive psychological outcomes in the long term. However, when people redefine the crisis as a punishment, it can lead to negative psychological effects. The findings that religious communities promote seeking and giving social support is also supported by extensive quantitative studies on religious coping in different religious populations. And lastly, another key takeaway is that the significant role that religious leaders play in encouraging behavior change during crisis. So in light of these key takeaways, it is important for policymakers, mental health professionals, and religious leaders to work together to promote positive psychological outcomes and effective crisis management. So policymakers, for example, can work with religious leaders to encourage people to carry out measures to manage the crisis. And for example, when adjustments to religious activities are needed, policymakers should work with religious leaders in communicating such changes. Mental health professionals should also be mindful of the various religious beliefs when working with populations that are religious, and work with religious leaders to co-develop long-term interventions to strengthen resilience. And additionally, religious leaders and other key figures in the religious community should also be trained in PFA. With regards to limitations and future research, future studies should explore the use of other religions or belief systems. For example, the use of indigenous belief systems that might be common in some parts of the world. And future studies should also study the use of religious coping at different stages of the crisis. So that's all for my presentation today. I thank everyone for listening and I welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.